So now that we've got a vision and the basic rules for the card game, we now need to refine it so that we can be sure the game is viable. Playing a sample round of your card game is one of the quickest and easiest ways to figure out whether your game is actually enjoyable. To build a prototype deck, I recommend just buying a couple of packs of cheap playing cards and then to customize them by writing over the cards with permanent marker. A lot of games end up requiring over 54 cards, so just be a devil and buy a couple of packs. When I was creating the prototype deck for Contraband, the item cards literally just had the name of the item and the number of points the item was worth on them. There's also some maths required to calibrate the probabilities of drawing different types of cards when you create a prototype deck. In my game, I kept an eye on how many of each item card I had in a deck to make sure the more valuable cards were harder to draw. The element of chance is an underrated factor which allows many games to continue to be exciting. The very first version of Contraband featured 3 rows of playing cards mimicking luggage going through an airport luggage check. Each card represented a briefcase with a specific item in it, some items being contraband items and other items being regular items. The idea was that as crooked employees of the airport, it was the player's job to rearrange the luggage so that they would be the ones taking care of the contraband during their shift. After a couple of playtests, I quickly realized that I had way too many cards down on the table at once, and that the amount of pick-up put-down involved in the gameplay caused it to be very clunky. The final game is no longer anything like this. By finding these flaws early on, you're able to quickly cull or change the things that don't work in your game. Testing your game with friends or family is also a good idea because they can often point out things you would have otherwise missed. Although I did say the final game is no longer like the game I described earlier, that doesn't mean I scrapped everything. The idea of inspecting luggage had potential, but it was too complicated and I wanted more than just a harder version of the game memory. By limiting the number of cards players could inspect, and by only letting players inspect the cards that were played by other players, I drastically changed the game mechanics. These changes not only resulted in faster gameplay, but encouraged players to compete with one another in a much more direct way. In terms of theme, the new version of the game still revolves around airport security, but I ended up making the pivot toward gameplay based around the baggage carousels of an airport as opposed to the security check itself. By creating and testing a really basic demo game, I could quickly find flaws in my game and then make the choice to either improve the flaw or remove the flaw from the game entirely. Something that I recommend you consider prior to the validity test is whether or not you want the game to be a physical or online game. Let me explain why you want to think about this ahead of time. Initially, I hadn't even considered the idea of creating an online card game, and I just jumped into creating the artwork once I thought my idea was viable. But you end up hitting a roadblock if you don't think about how and potentially who is going to play your game beforehand. If you just create a physical version of your card game, it's very hard to get people to play, let alone find out about your card game in the first place. By creating an online version of your card game, it becomes much more accessible and I would argue easier to share. Other advantages of creating an online card game is that it's much more cheaper to do. As we'll discuss later on, if you've got a physical card game, you'll have to pay to make changes in the artwork each time, because you need to get it reprinted each time. When you've got an online card game, any changes to it can be applied within an instant with virtually no cost. When everything's online, you also don't have the added burden of waiting for a new deck of cards every time you print. That doesn't mean you can't have a physical and online version of the card game though. It might make more sense to offer the physical version of the card game once the online game gains a following, so you actually know how many to print. One of the worst things that you can do is print a bunch of decks and tie up your cash in stock when you don't even know if people enjoy your game or not. If you want to be really lean, you could even build a prototype deck online, so it costs even less. Having said that, an online version of a card game is much harder to build. I was only able to create an online version of the game because I got help from people who knew how to code. My programmer built Contraband in a language that he had no prior experience in before. As a result, it took a good month and a half to learn the software and build the game itself. If you don't know anyone who can help you in this space, there's a steep learning curve, but it's still possible to learn how to code for yourself. Alternatively, you could find a programmer for hire. It all takes time, but where there's a will, there's a way. Realistically, you don't lose anything creating a card game, whether it's physical or digital, and you'll learn heaps during the process, so just go for it. Either way, we're going to start needing some artwork soon, so let's discuss that in the next one. If you want to check out my game for yourself, check out the link in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching.